start today by thanking you all for being here. I've had a fantastic time these last couple of days and have learned a great deal from the other speakers and performers. But I want to say a special thanks to Gabriëlle and the Studium Generale for hosting me, and to Vivian, Ziherl, and Natasha Ginwala for their visionary curating and their generous invitation. A few days ago, at the first convening of the Landings Project, curated by Vivian and Natasha at the Witte de Wit in Rotterdam, I read a history of poetry and translation and suggested that British imperialism developed a new pastoral aesthetic. What I call an imperial pastoral, in which the world to be colonized was figured as a field to be harvested and a population to be shepherded. It grew out of a pastoralism that had once depended on the opposition between the fantasized laborless existence of the shepherd and the pained labor of the farmer. But during the twinned period of revolutionary republicanism and industrial revolution in Britain and Europe more generally, that opposition was overcome by a simpler divide between country and city, and the rural was confused with nature. In the aftermath of that cataclysmic refiguring of the world, which coincided with British expansionism and its assumption of the place formerly occupied by the Dutch in the maritime world, the colonies became the scene and the screen for a nostalgic projection, which would nonetheless capture the world as if in the shadow of the magic lantern. Unfurling in that strange half-light in which Christian myth was renewed was a narrative of the world progressing from agriculture to industry. But, I argued, if we looked at the ancient imperial poetry that was summoned and translated by poets and British pedagogues who were carrying out the imperial project in schools elsewhere, we would learn that the tale to be told was not one in which farmers abandoned their fields for the mines, and the bucolic world thus lost to smog, but rather one in which mining was always already at the beginning of empire. In the poetry of Virgil, we find again and again the image of a reversible relation between peace and war, one whose very reversibility is conditioned and enabled by empire and by the mining it needs and seeks. This relation is rendered for us as the reversibility between sickle and sword. In the Georgics, Virgil described the awful predicament of war as follows. Respect for the plow is gone. Our lands, robbed of the tillers, lie waste, and curved pruning hooks are forged into straight blades. Peace is for him a futurity without guarantee, and it can be imagined only from the perspective of the future farmer who will till the soil of plains and, quote, find javelins corroded with rusty mold, or with his heavy hoe will strike empty helmets and marvel at gigantic bones in the upturned graves. Secreted within that much-cited image, with bronze or steel at its center, is the recognition that empire is always a project of mining, and industry is as much the condition of possibility of agriculture, at least of the sort that depends on metal implements, as it is the result of a surplus that sustains it. Mining is thus both ground and underground, the shadow and the substance of the imperial world. Virgil knew this, and so did Walt Whitman. And where are we going, Walt Whitman? In his ecstatic and mournful poems, his obscene and ravenously universe-encompassing testimonies to the democratic impulse, Whitman calls his readers to see plowmen plowing farms, see miners digging mines. And in Book 12, the Song of the Broad Axe, he repeats the same juxtaposition. Lands rich as lands of gold or wheat and fruit lands, lands of mines, lands of manly and rugged ores, lands of coal, copper, lead, tin, zinc, lands of iron, lands of the make of the axe. Muriel Rukeyser, that great witness to the Virginia coal mines and their devastation, said, "Women and poets know." And she was right. We should read their lines more carefully. But today I'm going to read another book with you, follow a different kind of line. I will nonetheless begin with the most haunting image from Virgil's Aeneid. It is the image of a frieze, which is to say the image of an image depicting young Troilus' death. Troilus is the boy unequal to Achilles, who falls beneath his chariot and is dragged by his hair in the madness of battle. A.S. Klein translates the text in a manner that reminds us of that central reversal upon which the entire body of Virgil's poetry works. The boy's spear reversed, furrowing the dust. John Dryden rendered it in the poetry of his own time, the most famous translation of Virgil, as follows: "The hostile spear, yet sticking in his wound, with tracks of blood inscribed the dusty ground." Here, the weapon that has not yet been buried for future farmers to unearth becomes not a plow, but a riding instrument, a tool of riding before agriculture. The problem is that the death written can't be read, for death is that which can never be read, even when it can be dreamt. This is because, as the most fundamentally real, it never ceases to not be written, as Lacan says. But let me abuse this phrase a bit to ask whether or not there might be a politics of not writing the deaths of others, which exceeds the question of the real and the symbolic being for Lacan that which never ceases being written. Here, however, as will become clear, we are talking not only of writing, but of accounting, a writing at the limit of writing, where the story effaces itself in the space between the violent commensuration of the commodity system and that justice which, though lying on the far side of commensuration, nonetheless depends on it. The project I'm presenting to you today in a provisional and preliminary form is an effort to learn to read the traces of mining in South Africa differently. It's a collaborative project with my friend, the artist William Kentridge. In our different ways, we are both writing or drawing on, in every sense of those two phrases, an account book that was kept by the central administration of the East Rand Proprietary Mines Company in the year 1906. It was a book that William purchased from a private bookseller in Johannesburg without any particular purpose in mind, other than the one which is a common part of his practice, namely to draw on the pages of the book, without, it should be said, ever illustrating it. When I saw the book, I was distressed to think that the histories inscribed therein, I was distressed to think that the history described therein might be lost to his art. You can imagine he wasn't quite convinced of my concern. I have been doing research on the gold mining communities of South Africa for nearly 15 years. And so the book represented to me a history of secrets whose overhearing I desired, lest that moment in South Africa's mining history be obscured or at least limited to official historiography. So William and I agreed that first and before anything else, my partner and I would photograph the book for archival purposes, but that he and I would then work on it ourselves in the form I've just described to you. We had already done a book together about William's work, but for this one we agreed that I would not comment on the drawings or even in many cases see them until I had already written about the pages in question. And I won't comment on them here either, but let you view them as I speak. The pages which you see here beneath the lines of William Kentridge's pencil are places of doubt for me. How shall we read these marks, these ciphers of an apparatus whose power and complexity knows few rivals in the history of the capital-state relation? There is good reason to believe that it is in the minds of South Africa that the lunatic apotheosis of biopolitics in necropolitics was first dreamt. Everything from swipe cards to surveillance comes from those minds. Certainly, the rationalizing of life and the assumption that work would not reproduce the conditions of the worker, but rather that the worker would be wasted in the reproduction of capital's conditions was realized there. Foucault once argued that the dream as a place of doubt is the other of madness. But you can't think about the gold mines in South Africa or anywhere else, without asking, what terrifyingly reasonable madness dreamt this world? In 1906, South Africa became the world's top producer of gold, a rank it held for more than a century, until 2008, when it was displaced by China. Displacing all of the rushes in the world, from California to Australia and Alaska to China, South Africa became, in 1906, the scene of a delirious drive for fantastic wealth. It was born, as the madness of gold always is born, from the fantasy that there is wealth to be harvested beneath the surface of the world, wealth of a strange and magical sort. For gold is an absolutely useless metal, too soft to sustain industrial applications. Its value lies in its very uselessness, which makes it the perfect measure of all other values and the perfect medium for adornment. The exorbitance of jewelry must always protect itself from being dragged into mere utility. We know this. But beyond the spectacle of adornment, gold is the ultimate fetish, the medium and the sign of an economic logic that depends on the creation of that which is beyond it. During the years of the gold standard, and even today, when people hoard gold as a hedge against volatile capital markets, gold was and still is the groundless ground of an economy whose hallucinatory violence depends on appearing as though there is somewhere a reserve in which is stored the truth of value. This shared dream has been implanted in the world, sometimes as a narcotic reverie and sometimes as a nightmare. It all depends on where you are in the rush. In South Africa, gold is mainly to be found in an area called the Witwatersrand, a small stretch of sedimentary layers that lays upon the map of South Africa in an elliptical shape, stretching east, north, and south of Johannesburg. It is now home to the deepest mines in the world, some reaching more than 3 and 4 kilometers below the surface, accessed in 2-story high iron mesh cages that are raised and dropped like elevator cars, though they resemble the crates that are used for animals in a zoo. The labyrinths and tunnels and shafts of the impenetrably dark places to which the elevators deliver the workers are hellish. The temperature sometimes approach 38 degrees, as hot as a fevered human body. They are damp and vulnerable to both explosive collapses and inundation by water. For there are rivers beneath and within the earth, just as there are caves. It is a folded landscape that lies beneath the surface, lit only by artifice and inhabited by the dead. Fossils of ancient creatures that once populated an inland sea formed by converging rivers, and the ghosts of miners lost in a century of violent accidents. Men whose bones now mingle with the earth, men and now women too, who have become dust and spirit both. Beneath a surface where cattle yet graze and corn is still harvested, a world nonetheless traversed by vast networks of highways and webs of power lines, is a phantasmagorical world, a world of surfeit and surplus generated in the forge of violent abstraction. As it turned out, our division of labor or practice, whatever it is that people like William and I do, turned out to be a division of spatial domains, or directionalities, and perhaps two of temporalities. He followed the horizontal, I the vertical. We drove across the land outside of Johannesburg, stopping at random intervals, while he made visual notes of the surface world. Later, he would draw this surface on the paper's surface, adorning the scaffolding of the page with traces of what was and what was disappearing. Because with the price of gold what it is, the mountains of the mine dumps are being re-excavated and hence removed. I followed the columns down the page and with them dove down to the subterranean world, not only of the mine, but of the bureaucracy that organized it, passing into the depths to follow the ghosts of those who have gone before. I found myself lost in the shadows and in search of a form in which to make visible that which is so constantly beyond the threshold of the visible world. This project inserts itself into the fissures between the sayable and the visible, to borrow Foucault's language. It is a testament of sorts to what lies beneath the world we daily walk. Above all, the page is a flat space, and so it is the proper residence of a space flattened. Geometry, the grid as assemblage of line, square, and rectangle, is the form of land as property, the form of the claim, the staked space. But above ground, the form is made real. On the surface of the high felt, the golden grass is shadowed by the enormous flat trapezoids of the mine dumps, those improbable half-mountains where the labor of the men underground finds its trace as waste. Haunting the incandescent in the moonlight, these dumps also bear the toxic future memory of cyanide and all the chemicals that are used to extract gold from the earth in which it is lodged. Signs at the perimeter of the loosely fenced mounds warn children away from the future of illness, but the beautiful blue lakes with their golden sands often prove irresistible. A former prison guard walking me across the finely powdered surface of one such dump informed me that it is probably full of bodies, either the carcasses of political struggle between the apartheid state and its opponents during the years before democracy, or the refuse of petty crime. Although the grasses grow on the slanting sides of these mines, and those seeds survive the poison in bloom and branch, you cannot lose sight of the hard and hardening line that makes it something other and more than a mountain. Follow it. Go down. That is the direction of the sum, though not of the totality. Go down, go underground, past the dead and the buried, the hidden and the discarded. The account book is an archive of expenditures, the costs and revenues of gold mining squared against itself. There is in these pages the residue of a world, the minutiae of which are documented with a miser's meticulousness. Candle wax and corn brewing, copper wire and construction supplies, iron nails and India ink, every item necessary for the artifice that is urban existence on the Highveld is marked on these robust pages that are stitched between the cash book's leather covers. Reading, we ask, and add to Roland Barthes' question of who writes. Who counts? Who counts? Who does the counting? Who counts as one to whom one owes an account? The native laborers, you can see the text there, the native laborers are unnamed in the cash book. Not so the Europeans. The native laborers are unnamed. Somewhere, someone has inked a finger, measured a naked body, weighed it, listened to its breathing, its heartbeat. Such was the practice of recruiters and labor brokers in the time of the cash book and until recently, that they weighed the body before and after it left the mine. When, after a few years of service in the underground, the miner's body began to slough off its muscle, starved by its spotted and shrinking lungs, it would be cut loose from the world of the contract, allowed to float like discarded paper ruffling across the veldt in the wind, and to die, wheezing. The native is counted but unnamed. So let us attend this word which would be a name calling, but not an act of naming, a term of accusation, but not recognition. The name is always a noun, but a common noun is given as a name only to those who will be buried in a common grave, those who are ghosts in the graveyard of the commons. So the native goes without a signature in this world, where the only indices are the accumulating scars. But how did the native become someone who could be, as is noted in the cash book, counting the costs, repatriated? To what nation does the native go? Whence does he come, enabled by the passes that are counted here in the cash book by the hundreds? To become a native in South Africa was to be evicted from space, though not from land per se, for pastoral peoples did not deem land a matter of private property, though they certainly acknowledged territorial authority. shunted into the margins of increasingly unviable land where neither grazing nor the growing of maize could be done on any significant level. Africans were then forced into migrant labor by legislation that taxed individuals and huts and demanded payment in cash. Marx would call this process originary accumulation. But like all originary processes, it would have to be constantly repeated. The invitation to urbanity renewed and withdrawn, the demand for movement inscribed in the closed circle of migrancy. When, in 1906, the lords of the Witwatersrand leveraged new laws to add a poll tax to the hut tax in Natal in the hopes of forcing men to abandon their farms for the mines, Bambata Kamatsingla led a revolt against the authorities in the area now called KwaZulu-Natal. The Bambata uprising, coming only a few years after the consolidation of the new nation following the Boer War, was the first real test of the new union of state and mining capital. But when it was over, the pathos of the victory for those named native would be narrated best by the Zulu poet V.W. Vilakazi. We agreed to leave the kraals. In herds we came, castrated cattle. The new state, forged in fire, we might say, cooks its books. Do you have this expression in Dutch? When you alter you cook your books. The new state, forged in fire, we might say, cooks its books and leaves its marks in the ashes with the careful calculation of wages paid to the miners who have abandoned the shafts to fight for the British in the Zulu uprising. And here too, in the echo of a name, Mungal Singh, is the prehistory of the afterlife of colonialism in apartheid. Encouraged by Mohandas K. Gandhi, yes, that Gandhi, whose newspaper Indian Opinion would urge Indians to fight against their black brothers in order to receive full recognition as citizens of empire. The miners who had fought with each other against rock now battled each other on the field and followed Achilles to stain the dust with blood. Unmarked in the columns of the cash book, but etched there in the wages of the subaltern soldiers, the tally rose to 3,500 Zulu men dead in the year 1906. Evicted and alienated, the African natives would nonetheless be refigured as people of the land. In four cyclic migrations that linked country and city via the phenomenon of the peasant proletariat, they were stranded in the demand for eternal returns until death, or until someone else could replace them. For a brief period, culminating in 1906, the gold mines of South Africa undertook an experiment in global labor importation, bringing some 50,000 Chinese workers to the Witwatersrand. They're here too, in the cash book. The coolies and Chinese defaulters escorted from jail after refusing to work in the miserable depths. Sometimes, however, there is a reference to a Chinese worker who chooses not to return home at the end of the contract, whether for the transgression that was love in South Africa, or for fear of even worse exploitation at home. The repatriation fees unused by the Chinese coolies feature as a credit. The recruitment of the Chinese workers was organized by an American geologist and mining engineer then living in China as the general manager of the Chinese Engineering and Mining Corporation. That man was Herbert Hoover, the one-time translator with his wife of the great 16th century treatise on mining, Georgias Agricola, entitled De Re Metallica, though you should know that Georgias began his life as Georg Bauer, Georg the peasant. Herbert Hoover would become the US president in 1929, as the world was about to be plunged into the first truly global financial crisis, an event that many have linked to the reestablishment of the gold standard after its abandonment in World War I. Herbert Hoover is not named in the cash book, but can we say he is not there, exercising, as he does, this force from afar? Herbert Hoover was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize 5 times. mainly for his work supplying food for war refugees following World War I. But Nobel appears in the cash book as the supplier of dynamite, even though the De Beers Company had commenced producing its own dynamite in 1902 at a factory in Somerset West in South Africa's Cape Province. How does one register that which is absent? The explosions underground enabled by dynamite were the cause of many accidents, of course. Roofs collapsed, rock walls burst open, underground rivers swept the miners to subterranean seas, where they too would become, or will have become, fossils in some distant time. Limbs broken, hands crushed, noses severed. The most common of injuries were defacements. What was a torture elsewhere was here a mere accident, if that is, one can use the term accident underground. The Chamber of Mines says there are no figures for accidents before 1911, but they are here in the cash book. It records the payouts for the wounded and the compensations offered to the families of the deceased, measuring the value of life in cents before seeking the final balance. Even so, the sum is missing. Between 1911 and 1994, 69,000 miners, mainly black, were killed in South African mines and more than 1 million injured. And that doesn't include the slow unfurling wounds of lung disease, though the mining companies also insured for that. Indeed, the actuary is the petty god of this sordid world, where the calculations of risks and benefits shroud the beneficiary, capital, in a mystic cloud. Against the actuary, the Sangoma sorcery and the rituals of Muti offer their palliations. Every mine has its shrine. But they do not keep the ghosts at bay. For accident is the horizon and the specter that is always awaited in the mines. This waiting cannot prepare itself for the eventuality that will terminate it, but constitutes a second order of time, a duration without futurity, beyond the cyclicity of migrant labor, and without the punctuation of the calendar with its days and months in measured sequence. In Mine Boy, Peter Abrams' brilliant 1946 novel about the life of a black miner in South Africa, the first such novel by a black man, the new recruit is told that if he is to survive in the mines, he must learn to stop fearing that his work may lead to nothing. In time, tomorrow, he is told, he will begin to stop thinking of the future. In time, he is told, he will stop worrying about the fact that the pile of rock at which he labors never seems to grow or diminish. Only when that occurs, advises his mentor, will he be liberated from the fear that possesses him in the mines. Still, learning to overcome the fear of producing nothing cannot, in the end, save the miner from the horror, the other horror, the collapse of the mine in which his comrades are swallowed by the earth. And only time will release him from fear of the violence that is labor in the mines. The inophile people, who already resemble the corpses forming a line, make drill boys defecate in their mine overalls, sings Ngwane Twane Motswafi, a miner whose song is recorded in David Copeland's marvelous In the Time of Cannibals. But it is perhaps the specter of the catastrophe, the rock burst, the inundation, the underground fire, or the gas explosion, and its status as the most exceptional of events, that finally banishes the everyday fear of the miner whose labor constantly disappears, ensuring that the miner remains captive in the cave of another's desire for gold. In Vilakazi's poetry, this captivity makes of the miner something like the metal he seeks, in an awful de-animating mimesis. Reading his lines, one is reminded again of that image from Virgil of the farmer's discovery, of the molded javelins and the upturned helmets. Here is Vilakazi once again. We too grow old and rusty in the mines. Our strength soon goes, our lungs soon rot. We cough We cannot rest. We die. Now, if mining is the origin of that double tool of culture and agriculture, the cough is the paradigm of its unsignifying trace. Just as the line in the dust will vanish, or become illegible as the mark of Troilus's youthful passing, so the cough is the trace of the miner's experience, but one that will not give up its meaning. Is it silicosis? Is it tuberculosis? Is it just a cold or an HIV-related infection? Such are the questions asked by miners in South Africa and by their lovers, those who lay next to them in the rasping night. So I begin and end there with the sound, or at least a soundtrack of the miner's body, and with the question of how to read traces in the space between their being written and their vanishing, between the lines, as it were. Now, then, I would ask you to imagine two different columns. One a myth, the other a dream, both of them voices. This from a poem entitled Jonah and the Whale at Blijverheidsacht. And Blijverheidsacht is a mine, a gold mine, a very deep and wet gold mine in South Africa. Word, a mouth. Break open the sky, make it blue and bluer still. Methane. Down here the world is dark as the first day. We look for light in the canary's wings, sound the dark with sirens. We are quiet, for we are exceeding afraid. Word, a mouth. And water like language rushes in to drown us. Rock burns, yet oceans beneath the land are home to tempests. We go down to possess them, to rage, vehement as the east wind that does not blow there, and the depth closes round about us. Word, a mouth. We are as fish, now breathing without our lungs. Our lungs are black, for we went down to the bottoms of the mountains. The earth with her bars was about us forever. We held our breath as one lover holds to the other on the last day. We pursed our lips and closed our eyes. We went down and our souls fainted, for we breathed without our lungs. Word, formless. The mouth opens, as does the earth, and as water rages below, soil rises, red like a whisper. We cried by reason of our affliction, our fear, our black lungs, the violence which was in our hands. We cried. Our affliction was our reason. We cried that innocent blood not be laid upon us, our fear, the violence that it might be a shadow above our heads. Mouth, a word, just one. Let it be rib, broken. This is all the eye beholds. Brace of steel or arc of bone, unbleached, holding the earth up, the heart in place. Rib, scepter, tooth and bone as relic if the body is not yet burnt. We hold our breath as one lover holds to the other on the last day. Now save us from temptations. Hold our hearts in place. Jonah, faithless with limbs aching, swims against the current. We try to recall a moment before this, before we cast our lot and the lot fell upon us. We who have doubted, who have only doubt, living our breathless lives in amber oblivion, we try to recall, but are dumb. Ear, a tin drum. Strike and strike again, teach us the sound of wailing. Teach us the sound of wailing, and lay not upon us innocent blood, but fill our mouths with hellfire and righteousness, that we may know before the plague comes how to save ourselves. Relief, wail in a landlocked land. The earth with her bars is about us. Down, down, beneath the bottoms of the mountains, we are afraid. Our souls faint, and a shadow above us falls. Jonah, faithless, with limbs aching, swims against the current. Because we were impatient, because the shade was not enough and the heat was far too great, because the desert at least lies beneath a blue sky, we bloodied ourselves and threw flesh upon the pyre and prayed, God receive our burnt black offering. Go down again, Jonah. Go down to that place where the rock burns and the air is wet enough for fish. Jonah, Jonah from his ashes spake not a word. Yet we bid him descend once more. Go down, Jonah. Go down into the deep. Go down to the mountain's end. Let the earth close round about you. For there is gold in the tooth of a whale, Jonah. There is gold in the tooth of a whale. I seem to have lost my cursor here. Can you? All right. It doesn't show on. Thank you.